My name is Harold Finch. I am 71 years old and I have bad knees, a decent memory, and absolutely no patience left for people who lie with a straight face while wearing a lanyard. I spent 34 years as head groundskeeper at Ashbourne Royal Garrison, a ceremonial military installation sitting in the flat, gray-green countryside of Wiltshire, about 14 miles from anything anyone would call interesting. Ashbourne was not a famous place. It was not the kind of garrison that appeared in documentaries or received visits from foreign dignitaries who actually mattered. It was the kind of place that existed in the background of the institution, functional, dutiful, and almost entirely ignored by the people at the top, except when those people needed something from it. I liked it there. I want to be clear about that. I liked the early mornings when the mist sat low across the parade ground and you could hear the first boots hitting gravel before you could see the men wearing them. I liked the way the old stone walls of the Eastern Barracks held the cold all summer and then, inexplicably, stayed warmer than they should have all winter. I liked the elm trees along the southern perimeter that I had planted myself in 1991 and which had, by the time I retired, grown tall enough to embarrass the fence they stood beside. What I did not like, and what this story is about, was the clock in the guardroom. It was a large, institutional wall clock, the kind with a white face and black numbers that you see in schools and hospitals and other places where time is supposed to matter. It hung on the wall directly above the duty roster board, which meant that every guard who checked his schedule also looked at that clock. The problem was simple. That clock ran 7 minutes fast. It had run 7 minutes fast for, as best anyone could determine, at least 11 years. Everyone at Ashbourne knew about it. The duty guards knew. The NCOs knew. The commanding officer, a man named Colonel Jeffrey Marsh, almost certainly knew, though he would never have admitted it. There was even a handwritten note taped to the bottom of the clock's frame at some point in the early 2000s that read simply -7. Nobody knew who had written it. Nobody removed it. Nobody fixed the clock. This is the kind of detail that tells you everything about an institution. Not the big policies, not the formal procedures. The clock that runs 7 minutes fast and the collective, unspoken agreement to simply know about it and never correct it. I am telling you about the clock because later, the clock matters. It matters in a way that nobody anticipated, least of all the man who eventually used it. His name was James Whitmore. He arrived at Ashbourne in the spring of 2009, 24 years old, newly posted from his training, and carrying the particular kind of seriousness that young men sometimes have when they have decided, genuinely decided, not performed, that they intend to do their job properly. He was not tall in the dramatic sense, not the kind of figure that commanded a room the moment he entered it. He was medium height, lean, with dark hair cut close and eyes that had the quality of listening even when he wasn't saying anything. He was the kind of person you forgot to notice until you suddenly realized he had been paying attention the entire time. I noticed him first on his third day when I was trimming the hedge along the western path and he was doing his morning patrol route alone. Most of the younger guards did their patrol with their minds elsewhere. You could tell by the way their eyes moved, scanning without seeing, going through a motion they had already internally completed. James walked differently. He stopped at the eastern gate and examined the hinge. Not dramatically. He just stopped, looked at it for a moment, then continued. The next morning, the hinge had been reported and was being repaired by noon. That was James Whitmore. He looked at things the way they were, not the way they were supposed to be. At Ashbourne, this made him, quietly and without anyone formally acknowledging it, exceptional. We became friendly the way people at small installations do, gradually, through proximity and shared small routines. He would sometimes take his morning tea near the groundskeeper shed while I was preparing my tools. He didn't talk a great deal, but when he did it was worth hearing. He asked questions more than he made statements. He had the rare quality of being genuinely curious about things outside his immediate concern. It was in one of these morning conversations, sometime in his second year, that he first asked me about how Ashbourne handled its inspections. I should have known then that the question was not idle. The announcement came in the third week of October 2011. Ashbourne Garrison was to receive a formal royal inspection, a full ceremonial and operational review conducted under the authority of the Royal Household Inspection Directorate, or RHID, which was a body that most people at Ashbourne knew existed the way you know a distant relative exists, by name, without much detail, and with the vague sense that their arrival would require effort. The inspection was scheduled for the 14th of November. The notice gave the garrison approximately 3 weeks to prepare. Colonel Marsh received the notice, called a full assembly, and delivered a speech that contained the words standards, excellence, and the eyes of the institution upon us, so many times that James later told me he had quietly begun counting them. The final tally, he said, was 17. What followed was 3 weeks of the kind of preparation that military installations do, with a thoroughness that is almost beautiful when applied to the right things and almost painful when applied to the wrong ones. The parade ground was resurfaced. The vehicles were detailed to a condition that exceeded their actual operational requirement. Documentation was reviewed, sorted, cross-referenced, and placed into binders with labeled tabs. Schedules were audited. Rosters were corrected. The guardroom floor was cleaned to a standard that the guardroom floor had possibly never achieved in its existence. Nobody fixed the clock. It continued to run 7 minutes fast. The note that said -7 continued to hang at its base. James threw himself into the preparation with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything. He was responsible for the overnight security log documentation, a detailed written record of all gate activity, perimeter checks, and guardroom incidents for his shift rotation. He reviewed every entry going back 6 months, corrected 3 small errors in date formatting, and produced a supplementary index that nobody had asked for but which, he felt, made the record easier to navigate. He submitted his documentation package to the duty sergeant on the 3rd of November, 11 days before the inspection date. On the 7th of November, 7 days before the inspectors were due to arrive, James received a routine administrative acknowledgement from the garrison's records office. It was a standard form, a confirmation that his documentation had been received, logged, and forwarded to the appropriate file. Standard procedure. He folded it and put it in his desk drawer. Then, because James was the kind of person who read things fully and in detail, he looked at the form again that evening. At the bottom of the acknowledgement form, in the small print administrative reference block, there was a file citation number. Every document submitted for inspection review received one of these. The citation number contained an embedded date code, a standard practice in the RHID filing system that indicated when the file had been formally received into the inspection record. The date code on his file citation read, October 29th. James had submitted his documentation on November 3rd. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he went to his desk, found the original submission receipt, and confirmed the date, November 3rd. His documentation had been submitted on November 3rd and acknowledged on November 7th. But the RHID file citation said the record had entered the inspection file on October 29th, 5 days before he had submitted it. He did not tell anyone that night. He went to sleep, woke up the next morning, and came to find me near the elm trees along the southern perimeter. He told me what he had found. He was calm about it, the way people are calm when they are thinking very hard and do not want the thinking to show. I asked him what he thought it meant. He said he thought it was possible that the inspection report had already been written, that someone, somewhere, had compiled and submitted the formal inspection findings for Ashbourne Garrison before anyone from RHID had set foot on the property. I looked at him for a moment, then I asked if he was certain about the date. He nodded. I told him to be careful. He nodded again and went back to work. Roland Pierce arrived at Ashbourne on the morning of November 14th at precisely 9:47, which, by the garrison's fast clock, appeared as 9:54. He was 53 years old, with silver hair groomed to a degree that suggested genuine personal investment, and the kind of posture that comes not from military training, but from decades of walking into rooms where he expected to be deferred to. He carried a slim leather briefcase that I later learned contained, among other things, a tablet device, 2 pens, and a printed copy of what I can only describe as a completed inspection. A document that should not have existed for another 6 hours, at minimum. He came with an assistant, a younger man named Davis who carried a larger bag and walked half a step behind Pierce with the expression of someone who had long ago accepted his role and was now simply executing it. Colonel Marsh greeted them at the main entrance with the kind of warmth that senior officers reserve for people they need something from or are slightly afraid of. There was handshaking. There were pleasantries about the drive from London. There was an offer of tea that Pierce declined with a small, practiced wave. I was trimming near the entrance path that morning. I watched the arrival the way I watched most things at Ashbourne, quietly, from a slight distance, with the particular invisibility that groundskeepers and cleaning staff develop over years of being present in spaces where important people have decided they are alone. What I noticed first was the briefcase, specifically, the way Pierce held it. It was not the grip of a man who needed what was inside. It was the grip of a man who had already used what was inside and was now carrying the empty result of a completed task. A subtle thing. The kind of thing you only notice if you have spent 30 years watching people move through spaces they think belong only to them. What I noticed second was that Pierce did not look around. When someone arrives at a place to inspect it, genuinely inspect it, they look. They cannot help it. Their eyes move. They catalog. Even experienced inspectors, even those who affect indifference, will scan a space upon arrival because that is the entire purpose of their presence. Pierce walked from the entrance to the main building with his eyes moving between Marsh and the path ahead. He did not look at the parade ground. He did not look at the vehicles lined along the western edge. He did not look at the guardroom. He had, I thought, no need to look. He had already seen, in the version of Ashbourne that existed on paper, whatever he was going to see. The formal inspection walkthrough took 4 hours. I learned this from James, who was positioned at the guardroom during Pierce's visit to that section. He told me later that Pierce had spent 11 minutes in the guardroom, less time than any genuine review of the overnight security log documentation would require, given that James had produced what was effectively a small binder of material. Pierce had looked at the cover page, asked one question about the index format, received an answer and moved on. 11 minutes. James had spent 11 days preparing that documentation. Davis, the assistant, had taken a single photograph of the binder's spine. By 2 in the afternoon, Pierce and Davis had completed their walkthrough, accepted a lunch that Marsh had arranged in the officers' dining room, and were preparing to depart. Before leaving, Pierce shook Marsh's hand again, said that Ashbourne was presenting well, and mentioned that the formal written findings would be submitted to the directorate within the standard 5-business-day window. James was standing near the entrance when Pierce left. He told me that Pierce had looked at him once, briefly, with the mild and entirely unspecific acknowledgement of a man cataloging a face he did not need to remember. That evening, James came to the groundskeeper shed. He sat down on the old wooden chair that had been there since before I arrived, and which I had never replaced because it was somehow still functional. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "The report was written before he arrived. I'm certain of it now." I asked him how he intended to prove it. He said he had already started. The evidence James collected over the following 12 days was not dramatic. It did not involve accessing restricted systems or confronting anyone directly. It was, instead, a very patient and methodical accumulation of the kind of small, verifiable details that institutions generate constantly and almost never expect anyone to read carefully. He began with the gate log. Ashbourne's main entrance kept an electronic record of every vehicle that passed through, entry time, exit time, vehicle registration, and the name of the duty guard who verified the entry. The system was not sophisticated, but it was consistent, and it had been running without interruption since 2004. James was one of 3 guards who had routine access to the log for administrative purposes. He pulled the entry records for November 14th. Pierce's vehicle, a black Jaguar registered to the RHID motor pool, had entered the garrison at 9:47 and exited at 14:22. 4 hours and 35 minutes on site. This aligned with what everyone had observed. Then James pulled the RHID filing system's public access record, a bureaucratic document that the Directorate published monthly, listing the formal submission dates of all inspection reports filed that month. It was a dry, administrative transparency measure that existed because a parliamentary oversight committee had once required it, and which virtually nobody read. The November filing record showed that the Ashbourne inspection report had been formally submitted to the RHID archive on November 10th. 4 days before Pierce had arrived at the garrison. James printed the page. He dated the printout. He wrote his own initials in the corner in the way that record keepers are trained to do when handling documents that may later be disputed. He then went further. He obtained, through a standard administrative request, the duty roster for November 14th. The roster showed that he had been assigned to the guardroom from 0600 to 1400 hours. It also showed the clock and time for that duty, recorded automatically by the garrison's entry system, 0600 and 3 minutes. He compared this to the guardroom clock. The guardroom clock, running 7 minutes fast, had displayed 0610 when James had arrived. He remembered this clearly because he had noted it in his personal duty log, a habit he had maintained since his first week at Ashbourne, writing small observations in a pocket notebook that he kept in his left breast pocket. He had written, "Clock says 6:10. System says 6:03. 7 minutes as always." This was the moment the clock became important. Because among the documents James had assembled, there was one more item. In Pierce's inspection report, the one filed on November 10th, 4 days before the visit, there was a single reference to the guardroom that described, in the anodyne language of official inspection, the duty conditions and personnel scheduling of the morning shift. The report noted, specifically, that the morning shift guard had arrived at 0610. 0610, the time on the fast clock. Not 0603, not the actual time. The time on the clock that everyone at Ashbourne knew was wrong, but that an outsider, arriving and looking at the guardroom for the first time, would have read as the correct time. Except Pierce had not arrived until 9:47. He could not have seen the clock at 0610. He could not have recorded a 6:10 arrival for the morning shift guard unless he had been given that detail by someone inside the garrison who had read the fast clock. Or unless that detail had been fabricated inside a report written before the visit, using information fed to Pierce in advance. And nobody had caught the error because nobody had compared the clock's reading to the electronic system's record. James sat in the groundskeeper shed that evening and laid out his documents on my workbench between a pair of pruning shears and a bag of winter fertilizer. He walked me through each item. I am not a man with formal training in evidence or procedure, but I have spent 34 years watching systems function and malfunction, and I recognized what I was looking at. It was a thread, one pulled carefully enough to show where the fabric had been cut. I asked him what he was going to do with it. He said he was going to write it up properly, every item sourced, dated, and referenced. Then he was going to submit it somewhere that was not Ashbourne. I told him that was the right call. I also told him to make 2 copies of everything before he submitted anything. He said he had already made 3. The summons came on a Tuesday. James had not yet submitted his formal report. He had been assembling the final version, checking each reference for accuracy, writing the covering letter in the careful, neutral language that he understood would carry more weight than anything emotional or accusatory. He was 4 days from being ready. Colonel Marsh's office called him in at 11 in the morning. Marsh was behind his desk when James entered, which was normal. What was not normal was that sitting to Marsh's right was Major Dennis Holloway, the garrison's administrative officer, who had no formal disciplinary role but who had been at Ashbourne for 22 years, and was, in the way that long-tenured administrators sometimes become, the institutional memory of the place, the person who knew where things were buried and who had a professional interest in keeping them there. James told me about this meeting in detail later that evening. He said Marsh had opened with something that was not quite a compliment and not quite a warning, something about James's record being strong, his work being valued, his future at Ashbourne looking favorable. The kind of framing that tells you immediately that what follows is the opposite of those things. Then Marsh had said, carefully, that it had come to his attention that James had been making administrative records requests that fell outside the scope of his duties, that this had been noticed, that the garrison operated on the basis of trust and appropriate boundaries, and that individuals who developed a habit of looking into matters above their station tended, in his experience, to create difficulties for themselves that were entirely avoidable. James said he had listened to all of this without interrupting. Holloway had said very little. He had sat with a pen in his hand and a legal pad on his knee and had written perhaps 4 words during the entire meeting. He had not looked at James directly more than twice. This, James told me, was what bothered him most, not Marsh's words, which were the expected language of institutional pressure, but Holloway's stillness, which was the stillness of a man who already knew how the story ended and was simply present to confirm it. At the end of the meeting, Marsh had said that James was a good soldier, and that good soldiers understood the difference between proper diligence and unnecessary disruption. He had not told James to stop. He had not used the word investigation or the word report or anything that could later be quoted as a direct order to suppress evidence. He was too experienced for that. He had said everything necessary without saying anything that could be written down and used against him. James had said simply that he understood. He had thanked the colonel for his time. He had left. He came straight to find me. I was near the elm trees again. I spent a great deal of time near those trees in the autumn because the leaf fall required constant attention. He told me what had been said. Then he asked me something I had not expected. He asked me whether I thought he was right to continue. Not whether the evidence was sufficient, not whether the risk was manageable, whether he was right. I thought about this for a moment. I thought about 34 years of watching this garrison and the people who moved through it. I thought about the fast clock and the note that said that nobody removed. I thought about systems that absorb and protect themselves and the people inside them who agree, generation after generation, to simply know about the problem and never fix it. I told him that the question wasn't whether continuing was safe. It was whether, 10 years from now, he could live with having stopped. That was the only question that mattered. He nodded. He went back to his room. 4 days later, he was ready. James did not submit his report to Colonel Marsh. He did not submit it to the garrison's administrative office or to any internal channel that touched Ashbourne in any way. He submitted it to the Parliamentary Defense Oversight Secretariat, a body that existed specifically to receive complaints and evidence from serving military personnel that could not be safely routed through their own chain of command. It was not a famous body. It was not a powerful one in the dramatic sense. But it had one quality that made it exactly right for what James needed. Anything submitted to it was automatically logged, time-stamped, and assigned a reference number that existed outside the control of any single department, garrison, or directorate. The moment James's submission was received, it was a matter of record, not Ashbourne's record, not RHID's record, a separate, independent record that neither Marsh nor Holloway nor Roland Pierce could reach. James submitted everything: the gate log printout, the RHID public filing record showing the November 10th submission date, the duty roster showing his 0603 arrival, the entry from his personal pocket notebook noting the fast clock's reading of 0610, and the single line from Pierce's pre-visit inspection report stating that the morning shift guard had arrived at 0610. He also included a one-paragraph note explaining the significance of the clock discrepancy, not in accusatory language, but in the neutral, factual language of a man describing a verifiable error and asking a simple question. How could an external inspector record the reading of a fast clock at a time when, by his own documented arrival record, he had not yet entered the garrison? The submission ran to 14 pages. The covering letter was 1 page. It was precise, it was sourced, and it contained no language that could be dismissed as emotional or personal. It was the written equivalent of a man placing a set of facts on a table and stepping back. He told me he had submitted it on a Thursday afternoon. I asked him how he felt. He said he felt the way you feel when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have finally set it down in the right place. Not relief exactly, more like the end of effort. The Secretariat acknowledged receipt within 48 hours. The reference number arrived by post, a small card with a printed number, and a confirmation that the submission was under preliminary review. What happened after that took time. These things always do. The institution does not move quickly when it is being asked to look at itself, but it does move, eventually, when the alternative is a record that will not go away. The preliminary review escalated to a formal inquiry within 6 weeks. James was contacted by an independent investigator in January of the following year, a woman named Catherine Doyle, who worked for the Secretariat and who, James told me, asked her questions with the same quality of listening that he himself possessed. They spoke twice by phone and once in person. I was not part of any of this. I am a groundskeeper. I was a groundskeeper. But James told me about each conversation afterward, sitting in the shed on the old wooden chair, and I listened the way I had always listened, carefully and without pretending to know more than I did. In March, the inquiry issued its preliminary findings. I never saw the full document. James described it to me in summary. It confirmed what the evidence showed, that the Ashbourne inspection report submitted under Roland Pierce's authority on November 10th contained information, specifically timing data and shift observations, that could not have been gathered during the November 14th site visit. The report identified this as a significant irregularity, requiring further administrative review. It did not use the word fraud. These documents rarely do. But it said enough. Roland Pierce was reassigned to a non-operational administrative role within RHID in the spring of 2012. There was no announcement. There was no formal statement. 1 week he was a senior inspector with a decorated record and a habit of arriving at garrisons with completed reports in his briefcase. And the next week, he was handling what was described in the internal communication that someone eventually told someone else about as a portfolio review and transitional position. He was 54 years old. He did not return to field inspection work. The RHID revised its filing procedure in the summer of 2012 to include a mandatory date-locked submission window that prevented inspection reports from being formally filed until a minimum of 24 hours after the site visit completion timestamp. The revision was described in the internal circular as a procedural modernization to improve documentation sequencing. It contained no reference to Ashbourne. It contained no reference to James Whitmore. Colonel Marsh retired in 2013. at the standard time for his rank and service length. His departure received the standard recognition, a formal dinner, a speech that mentioned his steady leadership of Ashbourne, a handshake with the incoming officer. Holloway remained for another 4 years, continuing to serve as the administrative officer with the same quiet, deep-rooted presence he had always maintained. He retired in 2017. I do not know what either of them made of what had happened. They never spoke about it publicly, and at Ashbourne, things that are not spoken about publicly tend, eventually, to become things that never happened. James was not punished. He was also not celebrated, which is the more interesting fact. There was no ceremony. There was no formal commendation. There was no conversation in which someone senior acknowledged what he had done and what it had cost him to do it. The institution, having absorbed the error and corrected itself in the quiet way that institutions correct themselves, moved forward without looking back. James remained at Ashbourne for another 3 years. He was promoted once in late 2012, which was either a coincidence of timing or an acknowledgement that could not be made explicit. I was never certain which, and neither, I think, was he. He was a good guard. He continued to be a good guard. He continued to walk his patrol routes with his eyes actually open, and to stop at hinges that needed reporting, and to maintain his pocket notebook with its small daily observations written in the careful hand of a man who understood that what you record and what you notice are, in the end, the only things you fully control. He left Ashbourne in 2014 for a posting elsewhere. We shook hands on his last morning. He thanked me, which I told him was unnecessary. I was the one who had done nothing but listen, which is a considerably easier thing than what he had done. He said listening was not nothing. I have thought about that since. The guardroom clock was replaced in the summer of 2013 during a general facilities upgrade that went through the garrison. The new clock was digital, accurate to the second, synchronized automatically to the national time standard. The note that said -7 was removed when the old clock came down. I do not know who removed it or where it went. I looked for it afterward, out of something that I suppose was sentiment, and it was simply gone. The elm trees along the southern perimeter are still there. I know because I drove past Ashbourne 2 years after my retirement, on a clear morning in October, and I could see them through the fence, taller than the fence now, catching the early light in that particular way that healthy trees do when the angle is right. I planted those trees in 1991. They did not know they were evidence of anything. They were just trees doing what trees do, which is to grow consistently and honestly in the direction of whatever light is available to them. I think about James Whitmore sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. When I read something in a newspaper about an official report that seems to have been written before the facts were gathered, or an institution that has produced findings that feel like they were decided before the question was asked. I think about a young man sitting in a groundskeeper shed with 14 pages of sourced, referenced, carefully organized truth, and a choice between setting it down and walking away, or sending it somewhere it could not be ignored. He sent it, not because he was certain it would work, not because he was protected, not because the institution rewarded that kind of thing. He knew, better than anyone, that it didn't. He sent it because the alternative was to become one more person in a long line of people who had looked at the fast clock, noted the 7-minute discrepancy in their heads, and agreed, silently and without ever being asked, to leave the note where it was and never fix what they knew was wrong. He was 26 years old. He had been at Ashbourne for 2 years. He did not have a powerful family or a senior mentor or a formal protection mechanism beyond the one that his own careful documentation had created. He had a pocket notebook, a printout from a public filing record, an electronic gate log, and a 7-minute discrepancy between a fast clock and the truth. He used what he had. That is, I think, most of what there is to say. The rest is just the ordinary continuation of things. Careers proceeding, institutions adjusting, time passing in the way time passes in places like Ashbourne, which is steadily and without drama, measured in rosters and rotations, and the slow growth of trees that nobody planted expecting anyone to notice them. The clock ran 7 minutes fast for 11 years, and nobody fixed it. And then one day a young man found that the 7 minutes were the difference between a lie and the truth, and he wrote it down, and he sent it somewhere it mattered, and the clock was eventually replaced. That is all. That is enough.